So in October 2024, Forensic Architecture, your office, published this major report called Cartography of Genocide, Israel's Conduct in Gaza since October 2023. And this report, which is major both in its finding and its size, since it's 827 pages, I think, is both informed by the work that your offices and you have been doing since the early 2000s, but it also departs from it in some major way. So in order to assess the departures, I think we should start with a recap briefly on what is forensic architecture, what does it do, its methodology, its ethical protocols, and its purposes. So let's start with that.
Yeah. So the kind of prehistory of forensic architecture is a project I was undertaking, a mapping project that was undertaking together with B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, in the occupied West Bank in the first years of the 2000s, during the time of the Intifada.
The second Intifada.
The second Intifada has just began. And Edward Said has published this article in the LRB calling for a contre-cartography of Palestine and lamenting the fact that, in fact, the Israelis control both the territory and its representation. It called for a kind of cartographic turn, and something like that inspired very much a group of, us young activist architects, and we started mapping out the crimes committed on the drawing board, meaning the design aspect, the planning of the settlements. There wasn't a map at the time. We had to travel through the West Bank, which was, kind of an area undergoing quite intense confrontations, in order to understand the way in which architecture and planning has been mobilized as strategic tools. And we thought if the crime of the occupation is perpetrated through architecture, that architectural techniques would help expose it. And out of that came a report that tried to our understanding, for the first time, to incriminate architects in human rights violations. So you'd think about the people that normally are considered to be the perpetrators of human rights violation being military personnel, politicians, police forces sometimes. And here crimes or human rights violation and war crimes were committed on the drawing board in the way lines were drawn, in the actual shape of settlements that were meant to cut apart, control the space, and create an unlivable zone for Palestinian, meaning all the arteries were actually chopped apart by the way in which the settlements were located, planned very much by architects that were previously military personnel. So they knew how to control space by cutting the arteries, taking the control points above, enveloping Palestinian-built fabric from all around, so that to constrain its possibility. And then later on, I started imagining when, and it was when that map and that report was one of the main evidence in the 2004 ICJ case against the wall. And ICJ being the International Court of Justice, where the court has actually ruled that the wall that Israel was building since 2002 within Palestinian territories was illegal and called for its demolition. Of course, it immediately got demolished. But that was, I was seeing that evidence being part of not only a legal process, but a legal process that was wrapped into a social movement and an anti-colonial project, because the failure to comply with the 2004 ICJ ruling is one of the starting point of the BDS, a movement for the boycott, disinvestment and sanction of Israel that has gained huge prominence within the conflict. And so again, I've learned two things out of that. One, that what we architects can draw and do can be taken quote-unquote, seriously by grown-ups in the international system, and then that cases need to be not confined to court, but part of a larger political movement. And that's how we've worked since. And then, I had a chance. I got a grant from the ERC around 2010 and 2011 to actually formalize a kind of a subdiscipline of architecture that we called at the time forensic architecture. We did not really understand it immediately to be what it is today. It was originally understood to be, kind of those type of territorial mapping and also an analysis of urban warfare that I was doing a lot of work on. More or less understanding the building as in an analogous way to the cadaver in, forensic anthropology. You look at the building, you look at the traces of the ruin of the building and reconstruct, maybe also like an archaeologist, what are the forces, physical forces, blast or, the blades of a bulldozer or gunfire that you can read from the material fact of the architecture. So we started developing modes of modeling and understanding cities undergoing urban warfare. And of course, at that time, in the early 2000s, in the first decade of the 21st century, cities became the targets of in a number of conflicts, across the sort of neo-colonial frontiers of Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, and in these places. Then something happened, and we didn't understand it immediately, but we kind of fell upon a technique rather than design it, because in 2005, mapping became redundant with Google Earth and Google Maps starting to make satellite analysis more or less publicly available. Of course, not in a resolution that we have today, not in a frequency that we have today, but you didn't need to map. And a map became a photograph, right? And a satellite image, as Laura Kurgan is showing in her book, also with own books, is an understanding of a photograph. You need to understand resolution and bandwidth and color and ground truth in order to understand what you see in a photograph taken from outer space. But it is primarily a photograph. And then other kind of images started emerging. And in those, I would say Palestine was again a kind of a laboratory of another kind of transformation. People think about Palestine as a laboratory of warfare and techniques of control and weapons and all those things that Israel later exports after practicing on Palestinians. But it was also in the West Bank at that time, in the first decade of the 21st century, that the kind of systematization of distribution of cameras and kind of video evidence, the collection and an analysis of what is seen in videos as evidence started to emerge with different projects, including Shooting Back and my friend Issa Amro and others were kind of promoting that kind of. Initially, you had to distribute cameras in Hebron, in other places, and later, it became in everybody's pocket with smartphones, and the means to distribute it through social media became very readily available. And then the problem was not so much about those trophy videos, because you had those videos that in the same frame you see a perpetrator and you see a victim and you see an act, and that is very easily packaged and it could go on social media. And still today these go and become the viral images. But for every one of those that you have hundreds, if not thousands, of cases where you have fragments, where you have a video of something just before something occurs. In another video, you have the sound of a gunfire, but you don't see what happened. In another one, you see a car rushing. In the other one, an ambulance is coming. In yet another video, you see civilians running away from a place with white flag. In others, you have a videographer maybe coming a bit too late out of a window, filming onto the street and commenting upon what they're seeing at that moment, meaning that to understand what you see in those images a kind of an art of composition had to occur. And then, you know, in the sort of open source revolution, when those became readily available, it wasn't really about finding that one video, it was about composing. And in order to compose, you need to do two things, very technical. You need to geolocate and you need to synchronize the videos. You need to know which video came first, what is the order of time in the videos, and what each video is capturing in relation to the other. Meaning the way of looking at videos was not so much for what they show, but for hinges to others. Right? So each image and each video became a gateway to see others. And what needed to develop is a kind of assemblages of videos. Sometimes 6 videos have to be composed, and in our biggest cases that came very early on, 700 videos had to be composed into a single case. And we realized that not the one way to do it, the only way to do it is via architectural models. And we had them ready, and we fell upon that technique. At the same time, Bellingcat was starting to geolocate in a very rudimentary manner, simply on satellite images with a kind of cones. But when you needed to understand things in a bit more complex way, you needed to build a 3D model, say, of a part of a city or a street. You needed to locate each camera within that model, and then each camera is moving, so you need to, you know, kind of like model the movement of each camera. And you need to start studying not only what's in the frame, but what's outside of the frame, and what's the relation between one frame and the other. And only 3D models can do it. And we had that. We had the people to do it. And very, very fast it caught the attention of the people that were doing analysis. And the first cases were drone strikes in the Pakistan-Afghanistan frontier, where we could actually start showing against the Obama denial that those were taking place, what was happening there. And at the time also, Bellingcat and forensic architecture were working very closely. Later, you know, kind of not parted way, but you know, we built the capacity. We were kind of complementary in our capacities. Bellingcat was very fast in hoovering in a lot of videos, doing the first sync and geolocation, and we were like slow into building the images into a studio. The kind of the architectural model was the optical device within which you could see, the only way in which you can understand the relation between things. But there was another ideological component to this project, and that was a certain kind of anarchic disruptor kind of joy at the time. We came out against, very, very clearly against the traditional investigative journalism approach that you know, the greatest investigative journalists are those that have connections in the halls of power, that know how to cultivate those connections, reward them, sometimes, you know, do the kind of give and take that you need to do in order to keep your source happy, and then would get the kind of the file that would leak, or the deep throat that would give you the material about this massacre in Vietnam or somewhere else. And we said we don't speak to anyone. In fact, the secret is already out there. And that's a different conception of secrecy. It's not that there is a wall between the domain of the secret and the domain of the public, but every secret policy leaves traces in the visible world, and it exists as videos or as receipts or as flight paths that exist, you know, and this is how also the extraordinary rendition policy, the most secret policy at the time of the CIA, was exposed by amateurs that could just connect fragments, you know, like the evidentiary flotsam that, you know, this receipt with this photograph and this photograph with this flight path, and finally you had the kind of the assemblages of images that came from open source. And it became an ideology of kind of like, we do journalism and we do human rights differently. So it disrupted the field of investigative journalism, but it also disrupted the field of human rights, because human rights still in the early 2000s was very much based on a very empathetic interviewers who coming after the fact into a place and ask you, well, what did you experience, and take notes in a paper and reproduce your testimony, and there become the conduit for testimony. in a sense, we thought this is redundant, no, because the testimonies are already given live, and also human rights field was part of human rights, was part of the humanities. No, it wasn't a kind of a scientific practice, although it had some, it was kind of starting to be interested in all sort of scientific investigations, etc. Human rights traditionally were those kind of empathetic, liberal left-wing people who were going to places and taking the testimony, and it was about the testimony, the direct testimony of victims that need to be mobilized against the scientific, technological, repressive power of states. So there was an ideology that kind of grounded those testimonies. And for us, we decided to refuse that distinction between evidence and testimony, between the misanthropic scientist and the heartfelt humanist. And in fact, everything that we were doing was kind of blaring that. We say a video that is taken by somebody who experienced firsthand a community at the forefront of conflict is both a testimony and a piece of evidence. In fact, we were looking at very recently. We were decided to look again at many of our videos, and we made an experiment in the office. We said, okay, let's not look at the images. Let's turn the camera off, but just listen to the audio of those videos that were taken by users. And interestingly enough, all of them, almost every person that records a video in real time leaves an audio signature on that. Sometimes they cry, sometimes they shout, sometimes they curse, sometimes they pray, sometimes they try to intervene, sometimes they narrate very clearly, sometimes they narrate very passionately, but there's always a trace of the subjectivity of the experience of the person that is encoded over the image that shows the materiality and the physicality of what is happening. And so you have evidence and testimony intertwined in that video, and we treated them as an entangled thing. So when we call it a forensic architecture, it's not that we refuse this sort of testimonial, humanistic, heartfelt approach. We had that. We felt very, very, very close to the witnesses, but we always combine the scientific and the testimonial. And then it was also a transformation of human rights that delivered the first agency of collection to the communities at the forefront of struggle, and rather than a kind of a process of mediation, started into a process of collaboration.